The medical mystery of medieval royalty. What royal bodies teach us about the birth of modern medicine? Here's something that will fundamentally change how you think about modern healthcare. Every time you wash your hands before eating, every time you brush your teeth, every antibiotic you've ever taken, every vaccine you've received, all of it exists because of lessons learned from the catastrophic health failures of people who had every advantage in the world. I'm talking about medieval royalty, the wealthiest, most powerful people on earth, who died young, died painfully, and died from completely preventable causes. And the shocking part, they had access to clean water. They had access to servants. They could have been healthy, but they weren't. Today, we're going to explore why the germ theory revolution didn't just change medicine, it literally saved civilization. And we're going to understand it through the bodies of queens who painted their teeth black, kings whose bones dissolved from the inside, and an entire aristocratic class that chose superstition over survival. By the end of this exploration, you're going to understand why the discovery that tiny invisible organisms cause disease was as revolutionary as discovering fire. You'll understand why hand washing before surgery was once considered absurd. And you'll understand why every medical advancement we take for granted today had to fight against centuries of entrenched belief systems that killed millions. Because the story of medieval royal health isn't just about disgust. It's about the single most important shift in human understanding that ever occurred. Let's start with something that seems simple today, but was completely misunderstood for thousands of years. Tooth decay. We know now that dental cavities are caused by bacteria in your mouth that produce acid as they metabolize sugars. The acid dissolves tooth enamel. It's straightforward microbiology. But medieval physicians had no concept of bacteria. They couldn't see microorganisms. They didn't know they existed. So when Queen Elizabeth I's teeth turned brown, then black, then fell out entirely, the physicians of the day had to explain it using the only framework they had, the theory of humours. According to medieval medical theory, the human body contained 4 essential fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health meant these humours were in balance. Disease meant they were out of balance. So when Elizabeth's teeth rotted, physicians believed it was because she had an excess of black bile, or perhaps a deficit of phlegm. The sugar she consumed wasn't seen as feeding bacteria, because bacteria didn't exist in their understanding. Instead, sugar was thought to be heating the humours, creating internal corruption that manifested as dental decay. The treatment: bloodletting to rebalance the humours, or applying poultices of herbs to draw out the evil vapours. Neither worked, obviously, because neither addressed the actual cause. Now here's what makes this fascinating from a medical history perspective. Elizabeth's courtiers saw her blackened teeth and interpreted them as a sign of wealth, because only the wealthy could afford enough sugar to cause such dramatic decay. So they deliberately blackened their own healthy teeth, using soot and charcoal mixtures. From our modern perspective, this seems insane. But from their perspective, they were mimicking a visible marker of status. They didn't understand they were mimicking disease. And here's the crucial part. Some of those artificial blackening mixtures contained honey, which actually did feed oral bacteria, causing real decay in teeth that had been perfectly healthy. So you had people deliberately inducing bacterial infections in their mouths without knowing that bacteria existed, without understanding infection, trying to imitate what they thought was a cosmetic choice but was actually advanced periodontal disease. This pattern repeats throughout medieval royal medicine. A health crisis occurs. It's misunderstood because the germ theory framework doesn't exist yet. The attempted treatment either does nothing or makes things worse. And sometimes the disease state itself becomes fashionable because it's associated with status. Let's trace this pattern through menstrual hygiene, because this is where the absence of germ theory became genuinely life-threatening. Medieval royal women managed menstruation using cloth rags that were washed and reused. Now, that part isn't inherently problematic. Reusable cloth menstrual products can be perfectly sanitary if properly cleaned. The issue was the cleaning method. They washed these cloths in stale urine that had been allowed to decompose until it converted to ammonia. From a modern chemistry perspective, we can acknowledge that ammonia does have some antibacterial properties. So there was a kernel of practical effectiveness in this practice. But here's what they didn't understand. The urine itself introduced different bacteria into the cloths. The rags were never heated enough to actually sterilize them. They were dried in environments full of environmental microorganisms, and then they were placed against mucous membranes, which are incredibly efficient at allowing bacterial penetration into the bloodstream. The women using these rags were essentially creating perfect conditions for bacterial infections, urinary tract infections, vaginal infections, potentially ascending infections that could reach the uterus and cause puerperal fever. But medieval medicine had no framework for understanding this. When women developed fevers, pain, or discharge, physicians would diagnose an imbalance of humors, perhaps excessive moisture or heat. They might prescribe bloodletting, which would weaken the immune system. They might prescribe douches made from various substances, which could introduce even more bacteria. The actual cause, bacterial infection, was completely invisible to them. Not because they were stupid, not because they weren't trying to help, but because they lacked the conceptual framework and the technology to see what was really happening. This becomes even more critical when we talk about childbirth, which was one of the leading causes of death for medieval women, including queens. Puerperal fever, or childbed fever, killed enormous numbers of women in the days after they gave birth. We now know this is caused by bacterial infection, usually Streptococcus or Staphylococcus bacteria introduced into the birth canal during delivery. The bacteria multiply rapidly in the post-birth environment, enter the bloodstream, and cause sepsis. In the era before antibiotics, this was frequently fatal. But here's what's tragic. Puerperal fever was almost entirely preventable through basic hygiene practices: clean hands, sterilized instruments, basic sanitation. Except nobody knew that. When Queen Jane Seymour died 11 days after giving birth to the future Edward VI, her physicians were baffled. They had attended to her with what they considered the finest care. The birthing chamber had been prepared according to all the established protocols. Windows sealed to keep out dangerous cold air. The room kept hot because heat was considered beneficial. Multiple attendants present. The best physicians in England in attendance. And yet she developed a fever, became delirious, and died. The physicians performed an autopsy and found internal inflammation. They concluded she had died from an imbalance of humors brought on by the trauma of birth. They had no concept that they themselves, moving between examining corpses and delivering babies without washing their hands, were the transmission vector for deadly bacteria. This is the crucial historical context that makes the work of Ignaz Semmelweis in the 1840s so revolutionary. Semmelweis was a Hungarian physician working in Vienna who noticed something strange. In one maternity ward, staffed by doctors and medical students, the death rate from puerperal fever was around 10%. In another ward, staffed by midwives, the death rate was around 4%. He started investigating why, and he made a connection. The doctors and medical students were also performing autopsies. They would go directly from the autopsy room to the maternity ward, examining corpses in the morning and delivering babies in the afternoon. The midwives didn't perform autopsies. Semmelweis hypothesized that something from the corpses was being transferred to the living women. He didn't know about bacteria yet. Germ theory was still being developed, but he instituted a policy requiring doctors to wash their hands in a chlorine solution before examining maternity patients. the death rate plummeted to around 1%. You would think this discovery would be immediately celebrated. It wasn't. Semmelweis was ridiculed by the medical establishment. The idea that doctors, gentlemen, could be carrying death on their hands was considered offensive. The prevailing medical theory still focused on humours and miasmas, bad air. The concept that invisible particles could cause disease seemed absurd. Semmelweis died in an asylum, his ideas rejected, years before germ theory gained acceptance. Think about that. A simple intervention, hand washing, could have saved millions of women throughout history. The knowledge that contamination causes infection could have prevented countless deaths. But it couldn't be implemented because the theoretical framework didn't exist to support it. This is why the development of germ theory in the mid to late 1800s was one of the most important scientific revolutions in human history. Louis Pasteur's experiments proving that microorganisms cause fermentation and disease. Robert Koch's work identifying specific bacteria that cause specific diseases. Joseph Lister's development of antiseptic surgery. These discoveries didn't just add to medical knowledge, they completely revolutionized the entire framework for understanding health and disease. Suddenly, practices that had seemed superstitious or arbitrary made sense. Boiling water kills bacteria, washing hands removes pathogens, sterilizing instruments prevents infection. And suddenly, practices that had been standard for centuries were revealed as actively harmful. Let's go back to medieval royal medicine with this germ theory framework in mind and look at what was really happening. When royal women's elaborate wigs, styled with animal fat and never washed, became infested with what historical accounts describe as maggots, we're looking at fly larvae. Flies are attracted to decomposing organic matter, which is exactly what rancid animal fat is. The flies lay eggs. The eggs hatch into larvae. The larvae feed on the rotting fat. This is basic entomology. But medieval observers didn't understand insect life cycles. They believed in spontaneous generation, the idea that living creatures could arise from non-living matter. So when maggots appeared in the wigs, it seemed to confirm that filth itself could generate life. This actually reinforced unhygienic practices, because if maggots could spontaneously appear, the solution wasn't cleanliness. It was accepting the maggots as a natural consequence of wearing hair. The same framework applied to lice. Body lice, head lice, and pubic lice are all parasitic insects that feed on human blood. They spread through close contact and shared fabric. In an environment where people rarely bathed, wore the same clothing for extended periods, and shared beds and furniture, lice spread easily. But medieval observers thought lice were generated from sweat and dirt through spontaneous generation. Some religious figures interpreted lice infestations as divine tests or blessings. Why? Because if lice arose spontaneously from the body, then having lice proved you had the kind of body that generated them, which could be interpreted as spiritual significance. The actual mechanism, parasitic transmission, was completely invisible to them. Now let's talk about cosmetics, because this is where medieval medicine intersected with chemistry in ways that were genuinely deadly. The white face paint used by royal women was typically a mixture called Venetian Ceruse, which was white lead in a vinegar base, lead acetate. From a modern toxicology perspective, this is a catastrophically dangerous substance. Lead is a heavy metal that accumulates in the body. It crosses the blood-brain barrier. It interferes with enzyme systems. It causes neural damage, kidney damage, bone damage, and eventually death. But medieval chemists had no understanding of heavy metal toxicity. They knew that lead-based paints created a beautiful white color. They knew the paint adhered well to skin. Those were the properties they cared about. Women would apply this lead paint daily. The lead would be absorbed through the skin. It would accumulate in the bones and organs. Early symptoms of lead poisoning include fatigue, headaches, and abdominal pain. These would be interpreted as humoral imbalances and treated with bloodletting, which would worsen the anemia caused by lead. As poisoning progressed, women would develop cognitive impairment, memory loss, and mood changes. Their skin would become grey and damaged, so they would apply more white lead paint to cover the grey, damaged skin, accelerating the poisoning. This is a perfect example of a positive feedback loop of toxicity. The treatment causes the symptom, which prompts more treatment, which worsens the symptom. Some women took this even further. Diane de Poitiers, the mistress of King Henry II of France, consumed a tonic containing gold chloride because she believed it would preserve her youth. When her body was exhumed in modern times and analyzed, researchers found gold levels in her hair that were 500 times normal. The gold didn't preserve her youth. It destroyed her bone structure from the inside through heavy metal toxicity. But she didn't know that. She had a theory about how the body worked, a theory involving vital essences and preservation of humors. Gold was incorruptible. It didn't rust or decay, so consuming gold seemed logical within that framework. The fact that it was killing her was invisible until it was too late. This pattern of invisible harm extends to clothing. Royal corsets were never washed. They couldn't be without destroying the structure, so the same corset would be worn for years, accumulating sweat, skin cells, and body oils. From a microbiology perspective, this created an ideal environment for bacterial growth. Staphylococcus and other skin bacteria would colonize the fabric. Against the skin, particularly skin damaged by the pressure and friction of the corset, these bacteria could cause infections, boils, abscesses, cellulitis. But again, medieval medicine had no framework for understanding that bacteria in the fabric were causing infections. They might interpret the boils as bad blood coming to the surface and recommend lancing and bleeding. The actual cause, bacterial colonization of unwashed fabric, was invisible. Let's talk about the treatments prescribed by medieval physicians for various ailments, because examining these through a modern medical lens reveals the tragic gap between intention and outcome. For headaches, physicians sometimes prescribed applications of bird droppings to the forehead. The theory was based on the doctrine of signatures, the idea that substances resembling the problem would cure it, and on the belief that heat from fresh excrement would draw out evil humors. From a modern perspective, you're applying fecal matter, which contains massive bacterial loads, to the skin of the face, which is highly vascularized and close to the eyes and nose. You're risking bacterial conjunctivitis, skin infections, and if any excrement enters the nose or mouth, potentially respiratory or gastrointestinal infections. The treatment is objectively worse than the headache. For fertility issues, women were prescribed treatments involving animal feces in various forms. Sitting over burning goat feces to allow the smoke to enter the vagina. Inserting pessaries made from crocodile dung and honey into the vagina. The theoretical basis was that these substances would wake up or strengthen the womb. The actual medical reality is that you're introducing massive quantities of bacteria into the reproductive tract. E. coli, Salmonella, various environmental bacteria from animal digestive systems. You're creating conditions for severe infections, pelvic inflammatory disease, scarring of the fallopian tubes. These treatments likely caused infertility in women who might have been able to conceive naturally. And here's what's particularly tragic. Some medieval remedies actually worked, but they worked by accident and the mechanisms weren't understood, which meant they couldn't be systematically improved. The use of sphagnum moss as an absorbent material for wounds and menstruation actually had benefits. Sphagnum moss contains compounds with mild antiseptic properties. It's also highly absorbent. So using moss for wounds could reduce infection rates compared to using nothing or using contaminated cloth. But medieval practitioners didn't know why it worked. They just knew that sometimes it seemed to help. So they couldn't refine the practice. They couldn't identify which types of moss worked best. They couldn't develop proper sterilization techniques for the moss. The practice remained hit or miss. Similarly, the use of honey in wound care, which appears in medieval medicine, actually has antibacterial properties due to honey's osmotic effects and the production of hydrogen peroxide by some honeys. But medieval physicians thought honey worked by balancing humors or drawing out corruption. They would mix honey with harmful substances, negating its benefits. They didn't understand dosing or application techniques. A practice that could have been genuinely helpful remained marginally effective because the mechanism wasn't understood. This brings us to one of the most important questions in medical history. How did societies transition from humoral theory to germ theory? How did we move from a framework where disease was caused by imbalanced fluids to a framework where disease was caused by microorganisms? And critically, why did this transition face such enormous resistance? The answer involves technology, philosophy, economics, and social power structures. The development of microscopy in the 1700s made microorganisms visible for the first time. Antony van Leeuwenhoek observed bacteria under his microscopes in the 1670s. But observation isn't the same as understanding. For 200 years after bacteria were first observed, they weren't connected to disease causation. They were curiosities, tiny animals in water. People didn't imagine they could cause illness. The connection required experimental evidence. Pasteur's experiments in the 1860s showing that microorganisms cause fermentation and that sterilization prevents it. Koch's experiments identifying the specific bacteria causing tuberculosis, cholera, and anthrax. This wasn't just observation. This was systematic demonstration of causation. And even with this evidence, acceptance was slow. Why? Because germ theory threatened existing power structures. Physicians had built careers on humoral theory. They had social status as learned men who understood the classics and ancient authorities. Accepting germ theory meant admitting that much of what they'd been taught was wrong. It meant admitting that simple practices like hand washing were more effective than elaborate treatments. It meant that the knowledge advantage of physicians over midwives and lay healers was less significant than previously claimed. There were also philosophical objections. The idea that invisible entities too small to see could cause major diseases seemed to violate common sense. How could something you couldn't see or feel be responsible for death? The miasma theory, the idea that bad air from rotting matter caused disease, seemed more intuitive. You could smell bad air. You could observe that diseases clustered in areas with poor sanitation. The mechanism seemed obvious. Germ theory required accepting that correlation wasn't causation, that the bad smells were associated with disease but weren't causing it. The bacteria thriving in the same conditions that produced bad smells were the actual cause. Economic factors played a role too. Accepting germ theory required major investments in public health infrastructure, water treatment systems, sewage systems, hospital redesigns to prevent cross-contamination. These were expensive. It was economically easier to maintain the status quo and blame disease on individual moral failures or bad air than to acknowledge that preventing disease required systematic social investment in sanitation. Let's return to the royal courts with this understanding of the slow transition to modern medicine. By the 1700s, some European courts were beginning to adopt more hygienic practices, not because they understood germ theory, but because empirical observation showed that cleanliness correlated with health. The French court of Louis XIV was notoriously filthy, but by the time of Louis XVI in the late 1700s, there was more emphasis on bathing and cleaner clothing. influenced by Enlightenment ideas about reason and observation. But this was still pre-germ theory. The understanding was that cleanliness was aesthetically and morally superior, not that it prevented bacterial infection. The practice of variolation for smallpox, which began spreading in Europe in the early 1700s, is fascinating from this perspective. Variolation involved deliberately infecting someone with material from a smallpox pustule to induce a mild case and create immunity. This worked. It reduced smallpox mortality significantly. But nobody understood why it worked until Edward Jenner developed vaccination in 1796. And even Jenner didn't fully understand the immunological mechanisms. The practice spread because it empirically worked, not because the theory supported it. This actually created tension because it violated humoral theory. How could deliberately introducing disease matter create health? It didn't fit the framework, but it worked, so it spread anyway. This is a crucial point for understanding medical progress. Sometimes practice advances ahead of theory. People observe that something works and adopt it even without understanding why. Then theory has to catch up to explain the observations. Other times, theory advances ahead of practice. Germ theory was developed in the mid-1800s, but it took decades for all medical practices to align with it. Some physicians were still practicing bloodletting in the early 1900s, despite germ theory proving it was harmful. Change in medicine is messy and non-linear. Now let's examine what happened in royal courts once germ theory began to be accepted in the late 1800s. Suddenly, the elaborate unhygienic practices of previous centuries were revealed as having caused immense, preventable suffering. Historical records were reinterpreted. Queen Jane Seymour didn't die from humoral imbalance. She died from bacterial infection introduced by unwashed hands. Queen Elizabeth I didn't die from natural lead poisoning as a consequence of cosmetics. She died from chronic heavy metal toxicity. Countless royal women who died in childbirth weren't victims of weak constitutions. They were victims of bacterial infections that could have been prevented with hand washing and sterilization. This realization created a medical revolution. By the early 1900s, antiseptic surgery was standard. Hospitals were redesigned to prevent cross-contamination. Physicians washed their hands. Instruments were sterilized. Maternal mortality plummeted. Surgical survival rates skyrocketed. The discovery of antibiotics in the 1920s and 30s provided actual treatment for bacterial infections rather than just prevention. Suddenly, infections that had been death sentences became treatable. Puerperal fever, which had killed so many queens, became rare and survivable. But here's what's sobering. We still see echoes of pre-germ theory thinking today. The resistance to vaccines in some communities mirrors the resistance to Semmelweis's hand-washing protocols. The appeal of natural remedies over pharmaceutical interventions sometimes reflects the same kind of theoretical framework that led medieval people to prefer herbal treatments over what we now know are effective medical interventions. The distrust of expert medical consensus echoes the philosophical debates between miasma theory and germ theory. Human psychology hasn't changed. Our cognitive biases toward visible, intuitive explanations over invisible, counterintuitive mechanisms are the same. What's changed is the accumulated scientific evidence and the technology to demonstrate that evidence. Consider antibiotic resistance, one of the major public health challenges of our time. This is fundamentally a germ theory problem. Bacteria evolve resistance to antibiotics through natural selection. The mechanism is well understood. The solution requires systematic changes in how we prescribe and use antibiotics. But implementing these solutions faces resistance because they require individual behavior changes for collective benefit. The same kind of collective action problem that made implementing hand washing difficult in Semmelweis's time. We know what works. Getting everyone to actually do it is the challenge. The COVID-19 pandemic revealed similar dynamics. Germ theory tells us that viral respiratory infections spread through respiratory droplets and aerosols. The interventions that work are masks, ventilation, distancing, and ultimately vaccines. But implementing these faced resistance because the mechanisms are invisible. You can't see the virus. You can't see the transmission. You have to trust the scientific framework. For people whose cognitive framework is more focused on visible, tangible threats, invisible viral particles seem abstract. This is the same cognitive gap that made germ theory hard to accept in the 1800s. Let's synthesize what we've learned. Medieval royal women weren't stupid or ignorant. They were operating within a theoretical framework that was internally consistent but empirically wrong. They made rational decisions based on that framework. If you believe disease is caused by humoral imbalance, bloodletting is a logical treatment. If you believe lice are spontaneously generated, accepting them as inevitable makes sense. If you believe lead paint covers imperfections without understanding heavy metal toxicity, using it daily seems reasonable. The problem wasn't intelligence. The problem was the foundational framework. The transition to germ theory required multiple breakthroughs. Technological breakthroughs in microscopy to make bacteria visible. Experimental breakthroughs to demonstrate causation. Philosophical breakthroughs to accept invisible mechanisms. Social breakthroughs to overcome professional resistance. And economic breakthroughs to invest in public health infrastructure. This wasn't a single discovery. It was a cascade of changes across multiple domains over centuries. And we're still in that transition. Modern medicine continues to refine our understanding of how microorganisms interact with human health. The discovery of the microbiome, the trillions of bacteria that live in and on our bodies, has revealed that the relationship between humans and bacteria is far more complex than simple host-pathogen dynamics. Some bacteria are essential for health. The germ theory framework of bacteria as enemies has evolved into a more nuanced understanding of bacteria as partners, competitors, and occasional threats. Medical science continues to evolve. What can we learn from the medical catastrophes of medieval royalty? First, that theoretical frameworks matter enormously. The framework you use to interpret observations determines what interventions seem logical. A wrong framework leads to harmful interventions even with good intentions. Second, that invisible mechanisms are hard for humans to accept. We're evolved to respond to visible, tangible threats. Accepting that invisible bacteria or viruses cause disease requires overcoming deep cognitive biases. Third, that empirical evidence must be systematic and reproducible. Anecdotal observations aren't enough. Semmelweis showed hand washing worked, but it wasn't accepted until germ theory provided a mechanism and multiple researchers replicated the findings. Fourth, that professional and economic incentives can slow medical progress. Changes that threaten existing power structures or require expensive infrastructure investments face resistance regardless of evidence. Fifth, that practices can work without understanding why, but understanding the mechanism allows systematic improvement. Medieval use of honey and moss had some benefits, but modern understanding of antimicrobial properties allows us to develop far more effective treatments. Sixth, that medical progress is cumulative and non-linear. We build on previous discoveries, but progress isn't steady. Sometimes there are rapid breakthroughs. Sometimes there are long periods of stagnation. The bodies of medieval queens teach us that privilege doesn't protect against ignorance. Queen Elizabeth I had access to the finest physicians in Europe, but those physicians were working from a flawed framework. She died from lead poisoning that could have been prevented with basic chemistry knowledge that wouldn't exist for another 2 centuries. Queen Jane Seymour had the best prenatal care available, but that care was based on theories that were fundamentally wrong. She died from an infection that hand-washing would have prevented, but hand-washing wouldn't be accepted for another 3 centuries. This should humble us. We live in an era of unprecedented medical knowledge. We've eradicated or controlled diseases that killed millions. We can perform surgeries that would have been impossible a century ago. We can cure infections that were death sentences. But we're still operating with incomplete understanding. There are diseases we can't explain. There are treatments that work, but we don't fully understand why. There are almost certainly foundational assumptions in modern medicine that future generations will recognize as wrong. The history of medieval medicine reminds us that current consensus can be overturned by new evidence. It should also inspire us. The transition from humoral theory to germ theory saved countless lives. Every child who doesn't die from an infected cut, every woman who survives childbirth, every person who recovers from a bacterial infection because of antibiotics, every surgery that succeeds because of antiseptic technique, all of this is the legacy of that theoretical revolution. The medieval queens who died from preventable infections didn't die in vain if we learn from their deaths. They represent the human cost of ignorance and the immense value of scientific progress. So the next time you wash your hands before eating, recognize that this simple act represents a hard-won understanding that took centuries to achieve. Recognize that people died, including queens and princesses, because this knowledge didn't exist. The next time you take an antibiotic, recognize that you're benefiting from a framework of understanding that Semmelweis fought for, that Pasteur developed, that Koch proved, and that countless researchers refined. The next time you encounter resistance to medical consensus, recognize that this resistance has deep historical roots and that overcoming it requires not just evidence but changes in frameworks, incentives, and social structures. The story of medieval royal hygiene isn't just about disgust. It's about the fragility of knowledge, the difficulty of changing minds, and the immense power of getting the theoretical framework right. It's about the fact that smart, powerful, wealthy people made catastrophically bad health decisions, not because they were foolish, but because they didn't have the conceptual tools to understand what was really happening. And it's about the fact that we, living in an age of germ theory, antibiotics, and advanced medicine, are the beneficiaries of a scientific revolution that fundamentally changed what it means to be human. Every queen who died young from lead poisoning, every princess who died from infected childbirth, every royal woman who suffered from preventable disease, they represent the world before germ theory. We live in the world after. The difference between those two worlds is measured in billions of lives saved and immeasurable suffering prevented. That's the real legacy of medieval royal medicine. Not the disgust of their practices, but the triumph of the knowledge that made those practices obsolete. And the reminder that the next great medical revolution is still waiting to be discovered. Perhaps by someone listening to these words right now, ready to question current frameworks and reveal truths we can't yet see.